Welcome to episode number 37 of the Teacher's Classroom podcast. Today we are going to be talking about digital equity. And on the line with me, I have Mindy Fiscus and Beth Holland. Beth Holland is a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Rhode Island and the Digital Equity Project Director at the Consortium for School Networking. She has 20 years of experience in education. She blogs regularly for Getting Smart and for EdUtopia. She holds an education doctorate from Johns Hopkins University, a master's degree from Harvard, as well as a bachelor's degree from Northwestern University here in Illinois. Also on the line, I have Mindy Fiscus. She is the Digital Access Coordinator for the Learning Technology Center of Illinois. She earned a bachelor's degree in business administration from the University of Illinois and brings 19 years of educational technology experience to her position. She also serves as the Illinois State E-Rate Coordinator and Illinois Representative and Governing Board Member to the State Education Technology Directors Association. So welcome, Dr. Holland and Mindy Fiscus.
It's nice to be back and to talk to you again.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah, I should say that I've had both Beth and Mindy on the show before. And the crazy thing is that for completely different topics. So you can tell that these two women are experts in the fields of education, and I'm just honored to have them back on the show as we talk about digital equity. So to start off the show, let's just talk about the future of schools. Mindy, you and I did a workshop one time where we talked about future ready, and we did this exercise with the people where we had them try to envision what schools would look like in the future. And so I just want your opinion. Can we start with Mindy, since you've done this before? In a perfect world, what do you think schools will look like 10 years from now?
So first, in the activity that we did before, we got to draw things, so a little harder to do in audio. So I have been doing this activity with leadership in administrator academies that I've had as well. And so I feel like I have a little bit of a dip into what other people are seeing. I guess when I look at 2030, I think more of a community of learning. The best vision for that is kind of like a student center on a college campus where you have like learning areas that's kind of a little bit more conducive to relaxing and gathering in small groups, and little learning kiosks or areas that you can go and hide away with a small group or individually to do some learning. But also on like a higher level, some more opportunities for workforce development, connections with the community, and collaborative nature with business and industry, because I see education moving towards more of a project-based kind of concept where learning is catered to the interests of the students and also real-world practice. So it's kind of what I see us moving to, a little bit online, a little bit physical, but in a new way of learning environment.
So your learning environments would be the modular kind. I would imagine facilities would look completely different.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we wouldn't abandon the facilities that we have, but just the environment of the facilities within the buildings would be a little bit more come and go and a looser definition of the traditional classroom.
Yeah. Okay. Beth, what do you see?
So I've got like two answers in my head at the same time, and so I'm trying to get organized. I think so. The first thing that struck me right off the bat was your question about the year 2030, and the reason why. And this is an example I often use when I'm talking about this idea of the future of learning. If you remember, the Jetsons, like the cartoon, the Jetsons, was actually set in the year 2030.
Okay,
and if you think about the Jetsons, right? So you've got, like flying cars, and they've colonized outer space, and like George Jetson goes to work and his car folds up into a briefcase and he walks in, and all of those things. If you happen to do a search for like Jetsons school, do like an image search, And what you actually will find, though, is, Elroy and his little school buddies are all sitting in perfect rows. And they're all staring at a chalkboard. And it is a chalkboard. The only difference that would make it not like the Flintstones school is that there's a robot teacher. And there's something really powerful about that image. And it was I started having that revelation several years ago. And then a professor of mine made a comment in class where she said, our imagination is bound by culture. And I always then come back to this idea of the Jeffersons, where, they had all the imagination in the world to imagine that we could colonize outer space, but they have this shared cultural experience of what school is supposed to look like that bound what they thought could be possible for school. And Larry Cuban and David Tyack refer to this as the grammar of school. We have this entrenched vision of school, and everything we try and imagine of what goes forward really gets tied into that. We have age-based grading and, physical structures, and whether we have kids in rows or kids in pods, it's still sort of this place-based experience. And so if I have to now think about a perfect world, I actually want to go back to a comment that Gary Steger made in a podcast a couple months ago with Will Richardson, where he said, we just have to remember that we stand on the shoulders of giants. And what he meant by that is we've always known, if we go back to the pedagogy, like what great learning should look like. And if we go back to the Piagets and the Papperts and the Vygotskys of the world, that we know that great learning is social, it's active, it's meaningful. I think it touches on a lot of the comments that Mindy made. And I think when thinking of sort of the future of school, I almost would like to say, how do we make the past a reality? We could go back to the apprentice model. We can go back to situated learning, where you learn by doing. I mean, all of these things have always existed. And so now the question is, how do we let the great practices become the new reality? And so there's this tension between what do we know of school versus what do we know of learning. And so I would like to be talking about the future learning and versus the future of school. That might be a long answer.
That's fair. Okay, so where in your vision, where does all this new technology come in? I mean, the apprenticeship and all that stuff that you're talking about bringing back, obviously it did not have technology. So where do you see technology fitting in?
It did have technology. I think this is where, technology is just what's a novel tool of the day. Right? Like a blacksmith had technology. You had to learn the tools of the trade. Alan Collins and Paul DeGoyd and some other researchers from the 90s, they talked about like the cognitive apprenticeship, where how are you learning to use the language of masters? So if I'm going to become a computer scientist, right, and I'm an apprentice in computer science, I'm going to use the language of problem solving and the language of computational thinking and the language of code. And how do I have those kinds of experiences? And I think it's not about focusing on the technology, but how does the technology create the experience for the learning to happen? Papers are great technology. There's always been technology, textbooks, overhead projectors, chalkboards. It's always been there. Just the question is, how do we make sure that it's in that service of the learning experiences that we want to facilitate?
I was just going to say, in relation to everything that you said, I did a quick search on the side while I was listening. There was this great YouTube series that it's several years old now, but it was called A School of Thought, A Vision for the Future of Learning, and it was put together by Pearson, and it gives you the vision from the mom's side and then two students' side that are living there with the mom. And I think that it is the learning in the everyday world, but using the bells and whistles of technology that Matt's referring to today. And I think that kind of learning in the just-in-time aspect of it is kind of what people think when they start trying to draw this out on paper in our AA academies.
And so, Beth, going back to your vision, how does digital equity fit into all this?
I'm so glad you asked. I'm working on that right now. So I'm going to situate this still in thinking about what we know about how people learn. And right now I'm completely fascinated by the work of a professor, Josh Eiler, who has a book called How Humans Learn. And Josh breaks learning down into 5 constructs. And I think this is where the digital equity piece really comes in, because he says we learn by curiosity, right? You have to be curious about something. Sociality. You have to be able to have conversations and to share your learning with others. We learn through communicating. There's an emotional context. Like, you have to feel safe. You have to feel not stressed if you're going to learn. Authenticity, meaning the learning has to feel authentic to you. That doesn't mean like I'm going to go down to the pond and measure something and that quote is the real world, because that could be a non-authentic experience to me. Like, children playing is a really authentic experience because they really believe in what they're doing at the time. And then the last piece is failure, meaning that we all learn from our mistakes. So now let's think about the equity piece. If I am a student and I'm at home and I have no internet access and I have no device, and I might be doing my, reading a book, and all of a sudden I get really curious. How am I going to expand on my curiosity? If I don't have access, I can't just go look something up. I can't now, and let's add sociality to it. I want to learn more about something. I can't now go connect to a community that might allow me to expand on my knowledge. I might now feel left out of things when I get into school. That's that emotion piece. If I have this access and I have something I'm curious about, I can engage in those kinds of authentic learning experiences that would be really valuable to me. I am personally in an authentic learning experience right now where I'm learning about some pretty high level statistics, and I'm learning through connecting with others, from using various like text references. I don't have the book I need with me, but I've managed to piece together what I need between like various universities and YouTube. And I have that chance now in these different environments to try things out, to see what works, to get feedback, that failure piece. When we don't have that equitable learning environment, when we're not ensuring that every student has that opportunity to learn, then we don't have that digital equity. And it's more than just saying, do you have a device and do you have an internet connection? But really being able to say, do I have what I need in order to be able to engage in those things that are truly going to let me learn? If we're talking about connectivity at home, because you were talking about kids having that experience at their homes where they, find something that's authentic to them, and then they're unable to pursue that path. I've seen the equity being broken down into several, what they call gaps, the mobility gap and the homework gap and the home culture gap. If we're talking about the homework gap with homework connectivity, if teachers are expecting kids to create projects or content that demonstrates their learning and their understanding, but it requires home connectivity, there's a gap. Is that what that means? So the term homework gap came from FCC Commissioner Jessica Rosenworcel, and it really was defined as a way to make the challenge of lack of connectivity really concrete for policymakers. And so by calling it homework, policymakers could say, okay, I get it. I had to do homework when I was at home. I mean, think about sort of who you might be talking to in the Senate or Congress, right? I did homework as a kid. These kids now can't do their homework. This is a problem. And that's really where it came from. I think the bigger piece with digital equity is this idea of it's that learning at home gap, whether it's to actually do homework or if it's to be able to actually engage in those broader learning activities. And there's bigger ramifications beyond it. It comes down to things like financial and social inclusion. If you don't have access, then how are you going to be able to, do online banking, look for a job, fill in a job application, again, connect with friends or family or peers or other learning communities. So there's certainly that piece of it. There's still very much some challenges inside schools where, there's the FCC minimum bandwidth requirements, which most schools, I think the last infrastructure survey said about 92% of schools can meet the minimum requirements. Those minimum requirements are pretty minimum and not necessarily what would be sufficient to support some of those higher level creative aspects. But, again, those gaps, there's also still a usability gap where how are the students really being allowed to use the technology? Are they using it to do the equivalent of a digital worksheet that's asking them just like low level recall? Or are they using it to explore and research and create multimedia and, work with complex models and solve problems and connect to the outside world? So it's, Matt Highfield in Beaverton, Oregon brought up a great point. At one point it was called orders. You had your first order divide, which is the basic, like, do you have a device? Do you have internet? And then your second order divide being that usability aspect. And then several of us are debating, like, is there a third order divide where we start to get even more nuanced in conversations about, do we understand about privacy and security? What are students being asked to sacrifice in the name of getting access? Are they using free apps that are taking their data and advertising to them, or are they using things that might be more secure? And do they have those choices? And so there's lots and lots of gaps. And I think it's definitely a complicated, it requires a nuanced conversation because I think it's a very complex challenge.
Yeah. And it sounds like those conversations, I don't think I've ever been a part of any of those conversations. So, Mindy, I'd like to bring you back into the conversation. And as you travel about the state doing your E-rate sessions, what conversations are you privy to, like, as you're walking around and eavesdropping on, the groups and everything? What conversations about digital equity are you hearing across the state?
Well, as it comes to the E-rate process and understanding that E-rate is a federal program that helps reimburse school districts for their costs involved with running the network in the form of network equipment as well as internet access. And what we find in the state of Illinois is that it's highly leveraged. We bring about, I would say, on average, $100 million a year into the state to help pay for those costs in order to just get the schools connected. And so it's a highly leveraged program, but it doesn't cover the internet access to the home. So there's been a lot of discussion in the last couple of years about that homework gap, Wi-Fi on buses being one solution. Doing community partnerships being another. And we had a recent survey here in the state. We've got about 40% or so of the school districts already reporting. And looking at those totals, a lot of the school districts in the state say they are 60% around say that they're doing some sort of one-to-one program at A or more grade levels. Most of those are in middle school, which surprised me. I expected high school out of that, but statistics are showing at the middle school ages. But we also asked, are you sending those devices home? And only 20% of those responding that they did have a one-to-one are sending those devices home. And the reason is because of the fact that their students don't have internet access at home. And they don't really have very good statistics on that either, because if you ask a family, in particular, a high need family, do you have internet access at home? A lot of people will say yes, because they're considering the internet access on their cell phone. Mm-hmm. And that's not necessarily internet access that can be used for student learning. And so I think we kind of have to think about how we're asking those questions when we do talk to parents in the wider community. Now, some of the school districts are trying to think outside of the box, and they're saying, okay, in order to be able to send these devices home and have them be usable, what would that look like? I know one community in the southern part of Illinois where the school board president is really passionate about the program and had several car dealerships. And so he opened up Wi-Fi access points at his car dealerships for students to use internet access at night, and then challenged the other community institutions to do the same. And so that's helped in some aspect. That particular school district is at probably a 60% free and reduced lunch rate. So really, really helped for a lot of that community having those open access points in order to be able to send some of those devices home. And I think they're in a pilot of the take home at this point. Most of the school districts that we surveyed, was around 75%, didn't have any kind of support for home connectivity. Kind of a little bit of a shocking highness level of that's not our job, that's someone else's kind of an attitude is the way I took it. And I think that the ones who are adopting it are focused on really promoting some projects that might work with local providers to offer discounts to people to get, and there are several, depending on the provider. We have several statewide where you can get, if you can prove that you are eligible from some state assistance programs, that you can get discounts on internet access at home, to also kind of checking out some Wi-Fi devices and sending them home with students. But it sounds like in those plans and in those things moving forward, those Wi-Fi devices have to be, specially reserved and have a good reason for those to go home so that the student can use those things. It's really kind of limiting the learning opportunities that are outside of the traditional school day that Beth expressed about just being able to, I take for granted the ability that when my children ask me a question at home and I say, that's a great question, why don't you go ask Siri, or why don't you go ask Alexa? And I take that for granted because there's so many homes that don't have that ability to just jump on an internet access device and find out more about that.
Well, and then also not just the connectivity at home, but also then the parental support at home. True. And there is really something to be said about that digital security and the privacy and the understanding the information that's in front of you, as well as being safe and secure and knowing what can be shared and what can't be shared. And we've done a lot of work on that in Illinois. We have some state law that requires digital citizenship to be part of your school day. And so I think that we've gone the first step, but it's just each year there's more being asked of those kind of curriculum models.
I mean, I will say, having talked to a lot of different districts in the last couple of months, some common themes that I'm starting to hear are districts who are trying to address the homework gap by making sure that you have parents as partners. So, I know both in Vancouver, Washington, and Beaverton, Oregon, where they also have a high ESL population, they do bilingual parent tech nights, and they make sure that the parents know, well, here's what we're giving your child, and here are the things that are happening. There's also, I love the car dealership comment, Mindy, because, there's, when it's possible, community Wi-Fi programs are great, partnering with libraries. I know in Illinois, Oak Park has done a great job partnering with the public libraries. And then, there are programs for getting hotspots for checkout, which is a great, until everybody's connected, it's a great opportunity between, the 1 Million Project or Mobile Beacon, Khajiit. There's definitely different opportunities for doing that.
And I think it's important to note that it's not somebody else's issue. It really is, school districts serve the greater good and are raising our future citizens. And so it is something we need to think outside of the box and really talk about ways to approach that. And E-rate might not be the mechanism for that, but we need to investigate what might be.
I mean, one other place, I went to the Digital Equity and Financial Inclusion Summit back in May in DC, and a great opportunity I don't think enough districts know about is Community Reinvestment Act funding through banks, and being able to, apply for grant money and potentially work with the local banking community as a way of financing opportunities to increase access.
Yeah, and I'm involved in CETA, as the description provided, the State Directors Association, and that's definitely something that has hit our meeting space in the last couple of years, really understanding how could we leverage that? What does that look like? And arming school districts with the knowledge of the program, sometimes to come back and educate their own banking structures of the availability of taking advantage of those funding opportunities.
So another topic that's in the news recently is the Digital Equity Act of 2019. And apparently that would authorize more than $1 billion in federal grant funding over the next 5 years to support digital inclusion programs throughout the U.S. However, if you read descriptions, it's not just for education. So when teachers read it, they get all excited. But do you think this is adequate? Beth, what do you think?
I mean, I think it's a fantastic first step, and Senator Murray's office did a great job putting together the bill, and it's been signed on to by a handful of Democratic senators. And yeah, teachers can't get too excited, because the way it works is that $1 billion would be spread across two separate grant funding formulas. One of them would be like it was a formula funding where, you know, depending on the number of people that you have in your state, you can get X number of dollars. You know, so like I'm in Rhode Island, we're tiny, we would get less money than say Texas, which is big. And a lot of that money was actually, from what I understand, is allocated towards creating state level digital equity plans. So again, it's a great way to get the states to start having these conversations about what to do with it. The other big chunk of money would essentially be open, where you could apply for it and say, I want this grant money to be able to fund, you know, building a network infrastructure to serve an entire county in, you know, North Dakota or whatever it might be, to be able to try and increase equity. So it's certainly a great step, and it's a great first step. There's several other bills also on the table, like attached to say like rural agricultural broadband infrastructure, which might help. Senator Udall and White House and Mastro Cortez and one more senator, and I'm going to apologize for not remembering who it is right now, you know, also put a bill out about being able to use E-rate money to pay for Wi-Fi hotspots on school buses. So, I mean, I think there's some great legislation that is starting to raise the level of attention required to this issue of digital equity that's coming at the federal level.
Yeah, and so I think the conversations, like you said, it always starts with educating the public, I guess, that it's a need, and as soon as you start having conversations, that tends to move things along. So,
yeah,
hopefully, you know, if money is spent to build plans, hopefully the plans will then get funded and be followed through upon. So, yeah.
I mean, I would just chime in to say that's kind of starting cash. I know that it sounds like a lot of money, but nationwide, it's kind of starting cash for the movement. It would really help if we could kind of crosswalk the other programs that people are taking advantage of, like the agriculture connectivity, the E-rate program, even the other programs that are run by the FCC, and kind of allow some flexibility that when school districts are installing fiber to the school district, that they have some kind of capacity to build in further capacity for the rest of the community. We're kind of have our hands tied as school districts to use E-rate funding to provide just connectivity for the school districts. And that limits the opportunity to really make a real change for a community, especially in the rural areas.
And I think too, just building on that, like the work that Shelby's doing, Shelby's the School Health Libraries Broadband Coalition, and their whole notion of we've got to empower the anchor institutions. Like this isn't, digital equity is, yes, an education issue, but if you think about it, again, particularly in rural or low to moderate income communities that might be lacking resources, you know, it's impacting the libraries, it's impacting healthcare. I've been reading lately about rural hospitals that are being shut down. And there's an argument of, oh, you could use telemedicine. Well, that's great as long as you have enough internet access. So it's, you know, it's certainly a much bigger challenge. You know, the financial piece, it's great that banks offer online banking services. That assumes you can get online.
Right.
Yeah, it's really convenient if you don't have to travel to the highest point in the county that's the top of a hill to access it on your cell phone at 3G speeds.
Right.
Which brings, so my question then, is there a movement out there for cities or municipalities or whatever to bring just Wi-Fi to everybody?
I think there's a lot of development associations in several of the counties in Illinois who are really looking at what their options are. There just are not a lot of identifiable options for where that funding's coming from yet. So I like the idea that the Digital Equity Act will have states looking at it holistically instead of these little silos all working on their own little individual projects. I think that would enable the smaller communities within a state to join together and say, how, you know, let's not reinvent the wheel. What are the best practices here? And what does that look like for the state as a whole? So I think that will help drive those conversations. Usually it's the college communities that are first to jump on board and try to connect their communities. And we've done a decent job of that in Illinois. But it's starting those other little community organizations. And I think it's moving in the right direction, and business is really coming to the table, and that helps as well.
So I'd like to totally refocus here for a minute or shift direction here and talk about schools and teachers as far as this digital equity piece. Because I think a lot of the whole homework piece we were talking about earlier, with homework assignments being required homework assignments that require digital productivity. And I think that some teachers, when they're like all excited about Google, they get on Google Classroom and they all of a sudden all their assignments are digital, and they forget that some of their kids don't have access at home. So, we've been talking big picture, but I think a lot of this conversation needs to also go back into the schools and focus on how the equity piece within their families is a real issue.
I mean, I can sort of jump in a little bit. And Matt, I'll get you the link. I actually wrote an article on this for Getting Smart about what are some strategies that teachers can do in the classroom. And I think the first piece, and Mindy mentioned it as well, is knowing. So as it's an early part of the school year, in some, like here in New England, school doesn't start till next week, but as you build relationships with your students, how do you get a sense of whether they have access at home and what that looks like? And not asking like, do you have internet at home? But, can you get your school device on home, online at home? Or do you have a laptop or tablet that can be online at home? And just to be aware of it. But another piece, I've been thinking about this a lot through the lens of universal design for learning. And the idea of, how do we think about the ways that we, provide content to students in terms of representation, and what are the ways we ask them to engage in action and expression, and what are the different motivational factors? And by thinking that we're going to go all digital, I think that's actually going against some of the premises of the student that might really want something on paper. And I think there's been such a big push towards digital when that may or may not be the best learning environment for every student. So I think as a teacher to think about, well, how am I making sure that my lessons and my content are universally accessible? And so it might be, yes, I am going to post to Google Classroom, and I'm also going to old school, like put it on the marker board and make sure that every student has 30 seconds at the end of the day to know how they've got their assignments taken care of, that the content is provided in multiple modalities. And then, the last piece, I forgot her last name, and she was fabulous. Her name was Rosette. It was a speaker I heard a couple weeks ago from Seattle, and she talked about how, as a student who had grown up in a sort of as she framed it, she's like, I was in an affluent community and we were like the least affluent people there. And so we didn't have the resources growing up. And to be in school where teachers expected projects to be done at home, when you didn't have, as she put it, like the glitter and the puffy paint and the multicolored things and the trifold, the big poster things, she said, that's creating inequity. She's like, I was always being told, well, if only I'd put more effort into things. And she's like, they had no idea how much effort I put into it, but all I had was a blue and a black pen and one piece of poster board that I had to save for. And so I think when teachers are thinking about what they're asking their students to do, how do we make sure that a lot of the creating and the high level thinking and the exciting multimedia, bring that into school when every kid has equitable access? And then take that universal perspective for what happens outside of school. The last sort of concrete vision, John Bergman, who's sort of one of the founders of the flipped classroom movement, said that when he envisioned the flipped classroom, he wasn't thinking about flipping lecture, though that was what was interpreted and people thought of it as a technology movement, but he explained it as flipping Bloom's taxonomy. So how do we have students who require the most support get the opportunity to do that high level thinking in school when they have the support? And we do the lower level thinking at home when you may or may not have equitable access to resources and support.
It's ironic that you put it that way, because that's kind of what's happening by default. So school districts are, and you mentioned Google, which 89% of our school districts in Illinois use G Suite. And so I think it's been such a popular program, not just because of the fact that it's free, but also because they can provide resources at a limited nature on those devices at home. And so that's been part of it, is the ability to do some offline learning in that fashion. But the mass majority of school districts are just literally prevented on doing learning outside of the school day. They're, keeping their devices at school. They're doing all of their homework at school. They're rethinking the way that they do their classrooms so that they can do that high level thinking at school. And they're sending back those textbooks and those, manual writing activities. And so that's what's being done at home because they can't do the technological things at home. And so I think that they're really kind of trying to think outside of the box and what does that look like? I had one teacher tell me that they had decided in their intermediate center, which was a 4th and 5th grade center, that they have gone no homework. As a change to Common Core, that was the teacher's mission, is to be a no homework school, because when they were attempting to send activities and homework home, it was either coming back incorrect or it wasn't getting done at all. And so rather than have to reteach those students, they took on the no homework mission. And there might be fun conversations starters and things that the students take home to have with their family, but all of the physical work is done in the school day.
Right. And so I think that those are valuable conversations that schools need to have within themselves as to what their expectations are going to be for homes, right?
Flipped learning wasn't meant to be a tech thing. You can do flipped learning with a textbook. It's the concept and the overall thought of it. And I would like more teachers who are not as tech savvy to kind of take a look at that again and see what it might mean to them.
Yeah. And so your idea of sending the textbooks home, right? And then maybe just having a class copy or two for when you're reinforcing things like, maybe you need to go back and read this, but only 2 people have to do that. So, yeah, that's a great idea.
And, sorry, one more to build on that. I remember doing a flipped classroom PD session years ago, and a high school English teacher looked at me and said, I've been doing this for decades. Because in a really great high school English classroom, the kids would go home and they'd read and they'd come in and they'd discuss and act out and do Socratic circles and create things with it. And this teacher was great because they said, well, this is just class. And so again, taking this all the way back to where we started our conversation is if we think about what great learning looks like, the technology and the digital access can certainly facilitate it, but it's about those great, meaningful learning experiences that we can create with or without the technology for all of our students.
Right. Yeah. And like you said, Beth, at the beginning, the technology has always been there. It's just kind of what's new, the tool that's new. And I always try to reinforce to teachers that are worried about, like I think what Mindy said about, Google Classroom, and teachers get all excited and want to go completely paperless, that's not probably the best avenue because there are so many different learning modalities. So
yeah, the Chromebook is no better of a tool than the pencil. It's just the way you use it.
Right. And it's a lot harder to figure out how to use too than a pencil. So yeah. So great conversation. Thank you both for being part of it. Mindy, how can people find you if they have questions or want to get in contact with you?
Okay. Well, we have a Learning Technology Center website. It's ltcillinois, all spelled out, .org. Under the About Us tab, you'll see all of our staff members. There are several of us on staff with different specialties, and that's where you can find me there. My email is also mfiscus, F as in Frank, I-S as in Sam, C-U-S as in Sam, at ltcillinois.org.
All right. And Beth, what about you? How can people find you?
So you can find me lots of ways. So we do have lots of resources on our CoSN website. So that's CoSN.org. I am personally like BR Holland everywhere. So you can find me on Twitter, LinkedIn. My website is brholland.com. And you can get me by email at this is one time, it's bholland@cosn.org. and I'm pretty findable, and I am very responsive. So please reach out anytime.
A quick Google search will probably get either one of us.
Yes.
Probably so, but yeah, well, thank you both so much. And thanks everyone for listening to this episode of the Teacher's Classroom Podcast. It's supported by the Regional Offices of Education in Illinois Area 5. And with that, we will sign off and see you next time. Have a great day.